sermon text for us as we explore the kingdom of heaven comes from Matthew 11, verses 25 through 30, and this is what God says. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this was your good pleasure. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and knows to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. This is the gospel of the Lord. Please be seated, friends. They decided to go down to a local park that was near their house while their Thanksgiving feast was being prepared in the oven. They decided to get a little game of touch football going on. And Monica and Ross, the two rival siblings, were elected to be the captains by themselves. And so Monica was going to choose her first teammate. And Rachel, thinking that she would be selected first because, after all, she was Monica's best friend, was sadly mistaken. As Monica said, I choose Joey. I mean, he was the most athletic of the group after all. And she was heartbroken and devastated. But Ross said, don't worry, you'll get picked. That only caused her to brighten up a little bit more because, after all, Rachel was Ross's girlfriend. Surely he would pick her. But instead he didn't. He picked Chandler, the last guy that was left. She was devastated. He said, don't worry, you're going to get picked. Monica was going to make her final choice. Surely Rachel was going to get chosen now. But the name that was called out was Phoebe. And after giving Rachel a kiss on the cheek, she ran over to her team. And Rachel was heartbroken. But Ross said, honey, don't worry. See, now I get to pick you. And frustrated, she looks at him and says, you don't pick me. You're stuck with me. Now, while all of us may gather around the TBS station to watch the Friends TV show scattered throughout the day, and we laugh about it, I think all of us can sympathize with Rachel just a little bit. Because we all have an understanding of what it looks like to not get picked. We know what it's like to maybe not get picked first. We even know what it's like to not get picked last. But she wasn't even picked. She just got selected by default. And I think all of us understand what that's like too. You see, in a world where we're not supposed to judge people, every human activity has a measure of judgment connected to it. The only thing that actually changes is just the standard in which we judge things, and the person who's doing the judging. And while none of us actually want to be on the receiving end of judgment, I think all of us have this understanding that in certain instances, that judgment is sound. Because not all judgment is bad either. For instance, I don't think any of us would think it's wrong if a football team didn't pick the slowest, tiniest, scrawniest, most asthmatic person to grab the ball and run to the end zone, let alone be on a team. I don't think any of us would think NASA would be wrong if they didn't select the kid who didn't graduate college, doesn't understand algebra, and never took a physics class in his life to build the next space station for astronauts to go to. Yet let's just say, instead of being rejected by a team, one is rejected by a community. Let's say, instead of being looked down upon and criticized because you lack a specific skill, you're criticized because you lack popularity. Jesus understands all those kinds of judgments because his earthly life and ministry was all about judgment. The judgment he received by every single person, ever. Jesus was chosen by God and yet rejected by people. Jesus came to those who were his own and they didn't want him. Jesus stood on a hill across from Jerusalem and said how he longed to not only be with them, but to gather them together so that he could give them help and aid, and they didn't want it. Jesus talks about how in one instance the people he went to praised his name for what he had done, and in the next were calling out his name to crucify him. Jesus knows what it's like to reap all manners of judgment on himself. The words that we have before us in this gospel lesson are a greater explanation of what Jesus was talking about after he sent out the 70 disciples to go minister to people. You see, he didn't wait for them to return to do ministry. He went to the area of Galilee and he went to carry on. And while he was there, some people of John came to him and talked to him about, "Are you the one we've been waiting for?" And Jesus says, "Go back to John and tell him the deaf hear, the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are healed, the demons are exorcised, and the dead rise from death." But in that instant, people began to criticize John the Baptist. The very people that had already and would continue to criticize him. And so he addresses the crowds and he says, "Let me tell you about you people. Let me tell you what you're like. This is what you're like. You are like children who gather in a marketplace, who call out saying, 'We played for you a song, and you didn't dance. We played for you a funeral dirge, a mournful song, and you didn't mourn.'" What Jesus communicated to them is that you're not just fickle. You're complaining about every single thing, and you're never happy. It doesn't matter if I tell you what you want to hear or I tell you what you don't want to hear. You're never satisfied. You're always going to find the negative and harp on it. You're always going to find something to never be happy with. Do you know people like that? People like that who complain about every single thing that never goes their way, or that seems to be missing from their life, and by the miracle that it's given to them, they still find something to complain about. Those are the very people that stand out in a crowd and say, "If there's a God, prove to me that he exists. Show me the evidence. Give me a sign." And Jesus says, a wicked generation exists that demands for signs. The Apostle Paul says, "Jews seek after signs, Greeks seek after wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to everyone." Jesus says those that demand signs are futile in their thought, because they're never going to accept them. They'll deny them, they'll try to explain it away, and they'll persecute the ones who by some chance bring it to them. And the reason why is because the measure of judgment that everyone has is the one that they themselves project on others. The only standard of living that people actually adhere to is their own, that they project on other people. And yet if that same standard was pointed right back at them, they'd be sitting in the fetal position, drenched in their own tears because they couldn't measure up to their own standard. And they'd still complain. God tells us of a prophet named Samuel who was given the task of finding the next king of Israel because Saul had lost favor with God. He went to a man's house by the name of Jesse. He sat in his living room and he watched as son after son marched in front of him. Each one a viable candidate, each one a pinnacle of human strength and experience. And every time Samuel thought, surely this is the one. And every single time God said no. Finally, God told the prophet, man looks at the exterior. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. God looks at what is inside. The guy that was chosen wasn't the strongest, wasn't the oldest, wasn't the biggest, wasn't the most experienced. A guy that was so inexperienced, he never served a day as a soldier in his life. A guy that was so experienced, he never picked up a sword, ever. He was scrawny, he was weak, he was young, he was immature. The only thing he ever held in his hand was a shepherd's hook or a sling. And the clothes that draped his body weren't shining bronze armor. It was a shepherd's rag. And yet the only weapon that he had the true weapon for the match that made the difference was he had a heart for God. He looked on his Savior with longing eyes of a child and held him in such high regard and faith. The exact opposite of what everyone in the world was doing. You see, the people during Jesus' day, they held on to the standard of man. It judges people based off of what it views as wise and strong and valuable. And God views things entirely differently. You see, God, He chooses the weak things to shame the strong. He selects the simple and the naive to discredit the wise and the philosophical and the eloquent. God praises the lowly and the meek and the humble to overshadow the pompous and the proud and the self-righteous. The very people that the Jews were entrusting their eternal life to, that held them to a standard that those people would never be able to meet. A standard that had over 300 laws that they would never be able to fulfill. Talk about a yoke that was overpowering them. They couldn't carry it, let alone lift it. And while you and I might not be subjected to ancient Jewish customs and laws, we at times so easily buckle under the yoke of this world for the sole purpose of merely being held in the light of people's eyes, to be liked, to be loved by the world, to be accepted by them. How many times have you and I just gone along just to get along? How many times have you and I tried to meet the standard of others that thought that they were superior to us? Whether it was the high school sports coach, whether it was the principal, whether it was the grandparent that said back in my day, whether it was mom and dad that set the example, whether it was the brothers or sisters who could do no wrong and yet you always seemed to do it, or whether it was yourself, setting a standard for yourself to exceed and go beyond. And perhaps you thought you got close, or maybe you never did, but at the end of the day, what did it cost you? What did it cost your mind and your heart and your soul and your body? The strain under such expectations that you can never meet. The Hollywood actor Matthew McConaughey, after he won an award, stood up in his commencement speech, his acceptance speech, and he said, "My father gave me this advice. Always look up to somebody greater than yourself and always chase after someone else." And he said, "So I selected God to look up to always. And the person that I would always chase after would be my future self." His point being that I would never, ever meet the 60-year-old me until I was 60 years old. And by the time that I'm 60, the person I would chase after would be the 85-year-old me. And even though his intentions were good, why would he chase after himself? The only standard that really matters is God's standard. And all we have to do is look in the mirror and see the scars from a life that's filled with disappointment of never living without imperfections. A life that's filled with flaws and all kinds of mistakes. And yet, isn't that the point why Jesus came in the first place? Isn't that why Jesus came to be one of us? After all, didn't he come to do what we couldn't? Didn't he come to be what we could never attain? Didn't he come to satisfy a God and Father that we always seem to let down and disappoint? And he says that is what pleased his Father. That simple message, that one would care so much for everyone else, that though we could never measure up to any kind of standard, he measured it to us for us. And it's that message that is so simple, so clear, so easy, and yet the wise thought was foolish, the strong thought was weak, and the skeptic thought was ridiculous. And they denied no matter what evidence was given. And yet God says that it pleased him to reveal it to those that are little children. Not just those that are infants, or those that are toddlers, or those that are teenagers, but those who are meek and humbled and huddled together, looking with longing eyes of a child at a father who loves them. Jesus says about those people that they're blessed because not only is theirs access to a kingdom, theirs is an inheritance called earth. The simple and unreasonable reality is that our entry into that kingdom has already been paid. The burden of our labor has already been conducted by somebody else. And the consequences of our failure has already been punished in somebody else's body. Also that person, that Savior, could look on us with acceptance and love so that he could call us with a tender voice and say to you and me, "Come!" Are you tired? Are you weary? Are you exhausted of a world that constantly puts more pressure and stress on you and layers it on like an onion? Jesus says, "Come! Come to me. I've seen your misery. I've heard your cries, and I'll rescue you." Are you burdened down with the pressure of just trying to maintain the peace? Jesus says, "Come. Come to me, my good and faithful servant. I am your peace." Are you tired of being worried about when the chaos is going to end and the uncertainty of what's coming around the corner? Jesus says, "Come. Come to me. Don't be afraid of the world. I've overcome the world for you. Nothing's too great for me." Are you worried about your past? About the mistakes you've made? About the guilt that you feel? About the scars that no one can see because they're on your heart and in your mind? Even though people said that you're loved and you're forgiven? Does that still weigh on you? Because Jesus says, "Come. Come to me because it's finished. I've carried that for you so that you can have rest that only I can give." You don't pick me. You're stuck with me. All those words may have been spoken by a fictitious character in a 90s sitcom series. Those words are actually spoken by us more than we realize, defining almost every single human experience that we might have. Perhaps as we look on the face of the person that we pursued for marriage, and yet they thought that we were unworthy of them. Perhaps the job that was turned down to us because we didn't meet their qualifications. But the one place that those words are never spoken, where that voice is never heard, is from God. Because God isn't stuck with us. He chose us. He chose us before the foundation of the world. He picked us. He selected us when He entered the world to die for us, even when we weren't worth it. Because we never would be. He picked us so much so that He decided to become one of us, to live among us, to suffer with us. And He loved us so much so that in our human weakness and frailty, He would look at us and say, "Now you have the rest. The rest that was promised for your souls, the rest that only I can give. A rest from the expectations that everyone has for you, and a rest from the expectation that my Father had for you. Because I fulfilled it in your place." And He looks on us with such a tender, compassionate gaze. And He invites you and me, regardless of how worried or beaten down or exhausted we may be. And He says, "Come. Come to me, because I care for you. Come to me, because I provide for you. Come to me, because I fight for you. Come to me, because no one will ever choose you like I have chosen you." You see, Jesus didn't choose us as a last resort. He chose us as a first priority. And He says that never will I leave you or forsake you. That's the peace that you have in the rest of Jesus. A rest that we don't have to worry about traveling to obtain. Because he went to the cross to earn. Let yourself rest on that choice, not on the selections of the world or the standards of people. But the standard of God that says, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And we see that so perfectly in the cross. Amen.